Welcome to Volume 8 of the Woodsmaster, where we teach you to be the Woodsmaster. In this volume of the Woodsmaster, we're going to be examining the fundamentals of tracks and tracking. Now, this volume is about the fundamentals. In later volumes, we're going to be discussing more advanced techniques like man tracking, counter tracking, team tracking, and so forth. Now, tracking is one of the most difficult of the skills we have to teach, and there's a reason for that. You see, tracking is a very visual skill where you're attempting to pick up sublime little tiny clues to the movement of some animal, person, or thing. Video, on the other hand, relies on overt images. It relies on images that stand out. So somehow we have to find a way to show you the invisible through a medium that only shows the visible. While showing discrete tracks may be a bit challenging for us, showing you the techniques for finding those tracks is not going to be so difficult. We're going to show you techniques that you can utilize for practicing the skills that you're going to need to really become a tracker. Now, something else about tracking. Tracking is not just about foot tracks. Tracking is an entire galaxy of skills that relates to things that appear in and around your world. These include signs and other marks that we're going to teach you a lot more about shortly. Well, I guess it's about time to get started. But before we do that, I want to introduce our guest instructor, Mr. Mark Sexton. There we go. You got to lay some track if you want to catch a tracker. The tracker I'm trying to catch is Mark Sexton. Now, Mark is a 5-year veteran of the United States Army Airborne Reconnaissance Teams, and he's one of the best there is. He's the guy I want to have to work on this video with me.
Before we go into specific techniques used in tracking, it's important that we define terms that are commonly used. Tracking itself can be defined as the art of a person following his subjects across the landscape using the tracks and signs that the subject leaves. When Ron passed through this meadow a moment ago, he created an example of what we call sign. One definition of sign would be any evidence on the vegetation or landscape that indicates the passage of a person, an animal, or thing. A definition of a track is simply the impression of the foot of the person or animal that the tracker is following. A definition of aging is when the tracker strives to determine when a particular track or sign has been produced. In this example here, this track was once filled with water, but already the water is beginning to evaporate. This is another example of aging in a human footprint. As you can see, the water is pretty much gone, and you have vegetation beginning to grow back inside the print itself. Later on, we'll go into more detail about the particulars on aging, but be aware that as the water evaporates, the track does dry out, and you can use it to determine the age of that footprint or track. The definition of tracking, often referred to as trailing, is when the tracker takes together the elements of tracks and sign left by his subject, puts them together, and determines such things as direction of travel and speed of movement. One indication, as you can see, is in this line of travel we have here in this sign. Now we'd like to talk about the 4 principles of sign: compression, patterning, displacement, and transfer. An example here of compression would be this footprint right here. In the sand, the foot is impacted into it and pressed it down into the ground. Basically, compression. Another example of the next principle of sign would be patterning. Right here in this track, you can actually see the patterns of the footwear sole. In nature, things are irregular. Therefore, when you come across a track, the thing that's going to strike your eye first is going to be the pattern of the sole. This is called patterning. The next form of next principle of sign we'll talk about is displacement. Right here in this track we have a toe push that's actually dislodged a piece of the beach soil here. This is displacement. Another example of it would be this twig. It's been slightly knocked out of its bed. And you'll look and you'll see where it originally rested, and now it's out of that original position. The last of the four we'll talk about is transference. Right up here on the rocks you can see water and sand has been transferred onto these rocks. This is called transfer. As a side note, I want to talk a little bit about a deception technique that people have seen and portrayed in the Hollywood westerns and some of the films. The technique is where the bad guys or the people being followed slip into the creek, follow it either up or downstream for a ways, and then exit the creek in an attempt to lose their pursuers. In reality, this technique is not always as effective as people believe. As you saw, when Ron exited this creek, he had a lot of water dripping off of him. You can look at this rock and you can see that the water has dripped onto it and splashed onto it, and also onto the beach itself. As a result, this water is not going to evaporate immediately. And what's going to happen is the people who were pursuing him are going to be able to see this more readily than if he had just stayed out of the creek. So this technique is not as foolproof as people believe.
Ron's talked earlier about the importance of practice in learning how to track. What we're going to do now is we're going to show you an exercise you can use with a friend to hone your tracking skills. In this exercise, what we're going to have Ron do is walk up the hill about 20 meters, and he's going to put sign and tracks down on the ground, and we're going to attempt to follow him. The advantage of this training exercise is that we'll be able to see, in this case, Ron, or your training partner, up in front of us. And we know that at regular intervals, there'll be some track or sign to be found. That way, it will build our confidence in knowing that the sign is really there. We won't create ghost sign. So, Ron, if you're ready.
Want me to get going?
Yeah, go ahead. The object of this exercise is to teach the tracker how to discern different types of sign on the landscape from that which is subject or target made. In starting out here, I'm going to use this pivot mark or action indicator that Ron made when he turned. Now you may not be able to see this right now, but later on we'll go into more detail with it. I'll use this as my starting point. From here, I'm going to track up to where Ron's at. I know for a fact that the sign is there. As a beginning tracker, you may not find all the sign as you go along, but your confidence is going to be a lot higher owing to the fact that you know that your subject's up there and he definitely left sign. And as you go along, if you get to a tough spot, don't skip it. Be patient, take a good look, and try to find every step that your subject made. This is training. This is what we're here for. So in saying that, I'm going to go ahead and make my way up to where Ron's at. And along the way, you'll hear me talking and pointing at things that I'm seeing. And this is what you'll do as you go along when you practice this at home on your own. Okay, what I've got right here is the action indicator or pivot that Ron made when he turned. From here, I can see his toe marks, and I can see vegetation and pine needles that have been displaced and the ground compressed. Up here, I've got a really good scuff mark. I've got pine needles kicked back out of the way. Again, a displacement and compression going on. No real patterning going on as the ground's particularly hard, but that's okay because again I've got compression and I've got displacement. Okay, as I'm moving along up here, I'm getting really good tracks. I'm getting the patterning from the sole of his boots. Again, more patterning. I've got full footprints here. All the way up, I can see each one of his tracks in this trail. One thing I like to point out is that when you're following tracks and sign, you're going to want to stay to one side of it. You don't want to step on your ground sign. You want to conserve it. That way later on, if you need to record it or you need to go back to it, it's still there. When practicing this exercise, it's important to realize that the track layer or sign layer, it's not a passive role.
that person or individual needs to maintain a consciousness of the 4 principles of sign. That way, when they're placing the tracks and sign on the trail you're going to use, they're attempting to leave an example of each. For example, right here is an excellent footprint which will show patterning. This next exercise we're going to show you is called the extended tracking exercise. In it, the track layer will make a circle and the track follower will then proceed to look for the tracks and signs made. The track layer will have to realize that he's got to follow the 4 principles of sign and leave examples of each along the way. Ron, you ready to go?
Bet I am. How far do you want me to go out?
Go out about 50 meters, cut over 20, and then come back.
Got it.
Okay, now the reason why Ron is going to go out 50, 20, and 50 back is because during training you don't want to create a scenario in which you're going to fail. You want to set yourself up for success. It builds confidence, and it also enables you to be able to find the maximum amount of sign and not have to take all day to do it. So that's why we set a little bit of parameters there in this exercise.
Okay, get started.
All right.
As the track layer, I'm carrying a walking stick. Now the purpose of the walking stick is twofold. One, it helps my ancient bones to get up the mountain, but the other reason is it leaves a second impression other than my footprints. That impression is deep. So when the tracker is following along attempting to locate my footprints, if he can't find them, at the very least he could find the sign left by the walking stick. That gives him a location, a place to search for the next track. And I think it helps a lot when you're going through the training exercises.
All right, you back?
I'm back.
All right, we're ready to go. Let's do it. In conducting the extended training exercise, when the track layer leaves his first tracks and sign, he's going to try to give the track follower at least one good footprint. In this case, I've got actually 2, and that's all the more better. The footprint will indicate the initial direction of travel, and then they'll follow up. What I'm doing is I'm marking behind the heel of Ron's footprints on this trail. That way I know each and every step that he's taken that I can spot, and I've identified it by putting a little half moon shape behind the heels. Okay, so as we're going along, we're going to continue this process. And one other point I'd like to make, I'm going to talk to Ron, or the person you're tracking with, pointing out things that I'm looking at. That way, if I see something that they don't, they can learn too. And they're also looking for sign. So it's not the track layer is not passive in this process. They're active and they're learning. And that's very important. That way no one gets bored. Everyone's actively involved, and that's critical into keeping this thing going. You ready?
Yeah.
Okay, let's keep going. All right, we got another hill print here. Okay, and what I'm looking at is some displaced pine needles too. Okay, you got that. And looking at this particular piece of sign here from Ron's foot, you can see that the stick right here has been broken. Typically what happens is that a person will step on a stick, the foot will compress it and break it, and then as the person moves, they'll drag it in the direction of travel. So it actually points in the direction they travel. One interesting note, to differentiate between a hoofed mammal and a human foot, very few hoofed mammals such as deer or elk will leave as large a compressed area as a human foot, a flat human foot. So if they break a stick or a twig such as this, you're going to find evidence of the hoof also, because they have a lot more weight per square inch concentrated on their foot than a human does. So you'd be able to tell the difference just by this large flat compressed area, the compression, and then the disturbance. And if it was a elk or a deer, you'd actually be able to see the hoof, evidence of the hoof. So that's. If you're having trouble during the exercise locating the next track or sign, remember you have the track layer with you, your partner. You can always ask them to give you a hand. You know, where did you go? What did you step on? Do you remember? And in that regard, they'll be able to help you out so you can regain the trail and also learn, because you came to a wall, you came to a difficult spot. Instead of just blowing by it, you stop and you work it out.
Let me tell you what I did here. I saw this track that was coming up this way. It's made by a motorcycle. So I thought what I'd do to confuse you a little bit is step into the side of the track of the motorcycle, hoping that would cover some of my trail.
Okay, got it. Okay, we've got some displacement. We've got a obvious scuff mark. I'm looking at a lot of vegetational flagging here. The sign's really heavy. We've got a lot of disturbed and bruised vegetation. You can see this is flipped over, pressed in. Continue on, you've got more of it. Real obvious vegetation flagging. On the vegetation, one thing that's going to catch your eye immediately is the lighter underside of leaves. Dark on top, light on bottom. That'll catch your eye instantly. Continuing up on this, on these tree trunks, you can see the bark, scales have been knocked off, branches have been broken, a whole host of sign right through here. We've got a real obvious break on this here as he came around. He stepped over all this junk. He's going back out over here. First thing that catches my eye, more vegetation's been knocked over down here. You can see the pine needles are pulled out of the way. I've got a toe pivot here and a divot in the ground where the pine needles are knocked out. This has been all knocked out of place. You've got bark off this deadfall here. Looking up in the tree, this is called a gate. People have a tendency to go through and in between trees. In this case, what happened, we've got a lot of broken branches up through here. You can see that on the ground. We've got the vegetation's bent up, broken branches again. Right here we've actually got confirmation. We've got a heel print and some exposed ground. Whenever you're following the vegetation sign, you want to confirm it with ground spoor. That's what we've got. And again, more pine needles and branches just broken.
Probably didn't see everything that Mark was pointing out. And the idea isn't to show you everything that he pointed out. What we're trying to show you is the process of learning how to track and how you report to your observer or to your tracking partner. One thing to keep in mind is whenever you're tracking an animal or a person, try to stay in touch with where you are. It's a good idea to get out your map and compass if you can and locate yourself from time to time. At the very least, look back. You see, our tendency is when we're tracking, we just look at the ground, and pretty soon we have no idea where we are.
Here I have a footprint. What I'm going to discuss next is how to properly measure it. Typically, you want to measure the length of the footprint from the heel to toe, from the furthest points apart. This distance here will give you the length of the foot. Then you're going to have your heel width and then the ball width. Again, you'll go from the widest portion of each part. On the heel, as such, this will be the heel width. Then you measure the widest part across the toe, that'll be your toe width. When tracking, if you have to record the information, such as in a search and rescue or a military law enforcement scenario, you don't want to try to say it's a size 8 or 9. First of all, different shoe manufacturers produce different size shoes, so trying to go by a size 8.5 or a 9 is not going to give you an accurate representation of the actual length. So you're going to measure it out with a ruler. Crime scenes, things like that, you got to get really detailed. You'll be using a ruler to measure the distances. If you're just doing general tracking, some military trackers, the actual length and width may not be as critical to have to measure it exactly. But if you're going to do it, again, you'll measure it from the widest portions. Starting from the heel of the track, what we're going to measure next is the stride. We'll go from heel to heel. You want to try to, again, keep it consistent. If you're going to measure from heel to heel, keep it that way. If you go from toe to toe, then stick with it. Whatever method you use, just make sure when you record the information or tell someone else about it that you indicate you measured it from heel to heel or toe to toe. That way they could do the same. I like using the heel because usually the heel strike is going to be the most visual part of the footprint that you're going to find anyway. So I mark the line on this heel, and then I'm going to go over to the next one, put a line behind it. This is going to be the distance. In this case, the distance is approximately 38.5 inches. That's going to be the stride. In addition to measuring for the stride, another measurement will be the straddle. What I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line from the widest point on the furthest track, which would be, or the next track, the right foot, and then I'll go on the outside of the left foot here, and I'll make a line. And what this will do is give me two parallel lines which I can measure, and it's approximately, again, 11.5 inches. So I know from the outside of the left foot and the outside of the right foot, the overall width or straddle is going to be about 11.5 inches. What we've gone over so far has given us enough information that if we're tracking and we come across other sets of tracks, we can use the data we've collected so far to exclude those from the subject or target we're tracking. It would be very rare to find another person who would have this exact same foot length, ball width, heel width, stride, and straddle. So by using this information and properly recording it, we can use it to exclude other tracks that we may come across while tracking. What I have here is a drawing of what I just showed you on the ground. Basically, this drawing is going to be used as my data sheet. I've got the straddle lines drawn in, and then I've got the stride lines drawn in. Creates like a grid or a box. I've indicated the overall straddle to be 11.5 inches. Again, going from the outside portion of the footprints. I've got my stride lines, which indicate 38 inches. I've also put in the overall length of the track or the footprint at 12 inches. And again, the size of this foot was actually 9.5, but we use 12 inches because manufacturer lengths differ, so you just take a measurement on it. That way you're sure you've got the proper measurement. The heel width, 3.5 inches. The ball width, 4. I've even wrote down the type of sole pattern, in this case a vibram. And looking at this drawing, you'll notice that the footprints are angled out. Some people refer to this as pitch. I haven't indicated it here because it varies a lot. And because of the variation, it's not going to be as critical to have this because, again, it's not going to be constant necessarily. Let's talk about track dynamics interpretation. Track dynamics is basically an explanation on how the foot contacts the ground and affects it. Interpretation goes into reading that sign or the tracks to figure out what happened. What I'm going to show you now is track dynamics. The foot is going to strike the ground, and when it does, we have what we call the primary contact point, or the initial contact point, followed by a foot roll, and then the final contact point, or the toe push-off. With the dynamics of a track, when the heel strikes the ground, as I said, we have what we call the initial contact point. The heel is going to hit the ground, it's going to register, then the foot is going to roll. After the foot rolls through, you're going to have what we call the final contact point. Typically that's going to be the toe, and there'll be some push-off. So our initial contact point is going to be the heel typically, the foot roll, and then the final contact point, which is typically the toe. In looking at this heel print, you can see how clear it is. I just made it. When you're out in the field and you're tracking and you see a heel print or a track like this, you know it was very recently made. The crispness is there. All the details are still there. There's no deterioration. It's very plain to see that it's recently made. I just showed you the important points of track dynamics. Track dynamics plays a role when determining how to interpret a set of tracks. When you interpret tracks, you never want to take one track and use it to try to make an interpretation for a whole set. What you'll do is you'll take it out of context and it won't read right. What we have here are 3 different tracks. Each track was made at a different rate of speed of movement. The one on the left was made at a normal walking gait. The middle one at a slow jog. The far right, a sprint. All of these are left prints. They're the left foot. When we talked about the track dynamics, we talked about the initial contact point, the foot roll, and then the final contact point and toe push. On each one of these tracks, because of the difference in the change in speed, the initial contact point, the foot roll have changed. The change was due to the amount of force the foot applied onto the surface. So obviously the heel depth is going to increase. You can see on the walking track that the heel and the toe are pretty much the same depth. In fact, if not for this bump, which is from the foot roll, the actual depth of the track will be fairly uniform. There's very little debris kicked outside the front of the toe. On the middle track, we had an increase of speed. This is the slow jog. The impact point on the heel, or the heel strike, will have the heel strike depth deeper than, say, on a slow walk or a walk. The foot roll occurs, and then the toe push-off. Now with the toe push-off is going to kick more stuff back, and it's also going to launch more debris outside of the track. And you can see that there is more debris out front. That's because of the increase in speed. The final one on the far right here was a sprint. Now with a sprint, because of the nature of human physiology, the heel is going to barely touch the ground, if at all. So the heel is going to have very little heel strike. In fact, you can just barely see the outline of the heel here. Conversely, the toe strike is going to be much more increased. And you can see a lot of debris has been thrown backwards, and you've had the toe depth increase also. It's greater. So by using the initial contact point and the final contact point, you can determine the gait that was occurring in that particular point in the track pattern. So track dynamics is important in interpreting the movement or the speed of the subject. So you can use that in conjunction with the distance between the tracks also. And used together will give you a very good picture of how fast your subject or target was moving. What we have here, you can see the differences in the distances between the tracks, representing different strides. On the far left, we have a slow walk. In the middle, we have a jog, a slow jog, and on the right, we have a sprint. All these are left footprints right here. This next set are the right prints. And you can already see, just in one step, how the distance is beginning to increase. Here's the slow walk, left, right. The jog, left, right. So you can see already, here's the heel, here's the heel. The distance has already changed, 6 inches. The sprint, here's the left, up here's the right, here's the heel. You've got about 14 inches of difference already. So it's obvious the distance is going to increase with speed, but when you look at it on a comparison, it makes it more dramatic. You can clearly see that that's going to happen. You use that in conjunction with your initial contact point and your final contact point. You can't go wrong. You'll have a very good indication on the speed of movement of your subject or target. You may have seen in Hollywood movies fugitives eluding their trackers by walking backwards. Well, in a minute, I'm going to show you how this really is not going to be effective with a properly trained tracker. You all having been shown the initial contact point and the final contact point, you'll be able to use this to determine that your subject or target is indeed walking backwards and not forward. You just saw me walking backwards. Now, a tracker, having learned the track dynamic principles, will know pretty much as soon as he sees this that this is what someone's done. The reason being that the impact points have been reversed. They've been flip-flopped. The person's toe, because they're walking backwards, is now going to become the initial contact point. And it's going to be deeper than the final contact point, which is now going to be the heel. So they've reversed. So what happens is the initial contact point, now being the toe, is deeper than the final contact point. And in this case, you can tell that the toe right here is deeper. Also, there's no toe push-off like we usually have, which looks odd in itself. And with the final contact point now being the heel, you can see that you have the push-off now. Right here, you have some push-off, and then you have debris thrown backwards. Whereas if this person had been walking in this direction, which is what they want you to think, the debris would have been thrown this way. But in reality, it's thrown this way. In addition, the tracks are now closer together, and again, the debris thrown backwards indicates that the direction of travel is going the opposite way. So the old Hollywood trick will not go with the properly trained tracker. The next action indicator we're going to take a look at is one we use to determine if a person's carrying weight. Ron's going to go down the trail carrying nothing but his heavy consciousness with him, and then after which he'll make another set of tracks with me on his back. Then we'll take a moment or two to take a look at the tracks and analyze the differences so we can get a better look at this action indicator.
Okay.
Ready?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, God! Oh! You said you'd kiss me before we did this. Oh! God! Mark, you gotta go on a diet, man! Oh! Man! Oh!
Ron just walked through this sign pit. These tracks here are the ones where he didn't have anything on his back. He wasn't carrying me. You'll notice that the tracks are straighter, there's less pitch, in other words they're not angled out, and that they're farther apart. And they're almost in a line. You could almost draw a line from one to the other. Very little straddle. This set of tracks, this is a right track, left, right, is when he was carrying me on his back. You'll notice that they have a pitch or an outward angle. They're closer together, and then that the straddle has increased dramatically. Here's a line connecting the right and the two rights, and then the left foot, if you draw a line in the center of it, and you can see already that the straddle is increased. This is to make his balance, center of gravity, more stable for the extra weight he was carrying. If you see this in tracks, this will indicate to you that a person is carrying a heavy weight. Another thing I'd like to point out is that the heels, if you look close enough, have a difference in depth. For example, this one here is the one where Ron did not have me on his back. This one over here is where he was carrying me. The heels are much deeper. If you get in an area where the ground's really hard or you have a lot of vegetation where you're not getting clear prints, one way to look to interpret this is the compactness of the material. This area over here will be less compact than, say, this one where the weight was pressed on it where he was carrying me. So you're going to look for that also. What I'd like to talk to you about next is what we call the track following procedure. The track following procedure has several components. They're fairly simple, and when you use them consistently, it will enable you to close what we call the time distance factor, which we'll discuss later. The first thing you need to do is determine the correct set of tracks or sign you wish to follow. After you do this, you're going to look out in the direction of travel that those tracks and signs are indicating, and then you're going to try to find more tracks and sign that you can visually link up to, and then you're going to move out to the furthest one. In this case, I've got my track and sign in front of me. I can see more going out in front. You'll see a bare spot next to the right of that thistle, and that's the furthest I can see, so I'm going to walk out to that one. Okay, now as I'm walking out to here, I'm going to be looking out in front of me for more tracks and signs. That way I can keep the pace of the follow-up going, the momentum keeps going. So now I'm going to repeat the procedure over again, and I'll keep doing that until I contact the targeted subject I'm following or need to stop. Okay, go ahead and take a breath and relax. I got a little spiel I'm going to tell you. It's about the time distance factor. In tracking, the time distance factor is very important. It's going to enable you to determine how far out your subject or target has moved away from the particular tracker sign you're currently at. The time distance factor is exactly what it says. It's the time and the distance away from you, the tracker, at that particular point your subject is. What you're going to do is you're going to have to make a guesstimation on the age of the track. In other words, you're going to have to determine, is it 2 hours old, 3 hours, or 4? After you make a determination on the age, you're going to look at the environment and you're going to say to yourself, how fast would a person or animal, if you're tracking an animal, move in this particular environment? In the case of humans, you could reckon that they might be able to travel, say, 3 miles. So if you determine the average age of the track is, say, 3 hours, and you determine they can move 3 miles per hour on that particular terrain, your time distance factor is going to be 3/3. Then what you would do is you take your last known tracker sign and you'd mark it on a graph paper. You'd write down, you draw a line out from it, you put 3 hours on it, 3 miles. You'd multiply those. That's going to be 9 miles. And that line is going to be the radius of the circle. And in that circle would be your subject or target. And you would use this to determine the tactics or strategies you could use to cut down the time distance gap. And that way you could close with and contact that which you're following. I've just been using the track following procedures. However, I've got a problem. I can no longer see the tracks or signs of my subject. What I need to do now is employ what we call the search drills. There are 3 basic types of search drills: the quick scan, the linear search, and the round search. The quick scan is just what it says. It's a quick scan. It's a look. When you come to a point where you can no longer see tracker sign, you're going to scan out from your last known tracker sign approximately 20 or 30 feet and then scan back. Now, an important note I'd like to make right now is never go past your last known tracker sign. To do so is putting yourself out in the unknown and you're kind of just flapping around. You don't want that to happen, so never go past your last known tracker sign. So I'll scan out in front of me in a pattern 20 to 30 feet and then I'll scan back. If I don't regain the tracker sign at that point, I'm going to look to my left and I'll do the same thing. And in this case, what I'd be looking for is brush. There's a lot of brush behind me and I'd be looking to see if there was anything broken. There's nothing. Now I'll look to my right and I'll scan outward again. Same thing. I'm looking at the brush and the grasses. Nothing's there. Scan back. Nothing. At this point, having not regained the tracker sign, I'm going to go into what I call the linear search. The linear search. The linear search is used when the tracker has not recovered the tracker sign from the quick scan. The tracker will then determine the direction of travel he thinks most likely taken by his subject. He'll then advance out 5 to 15 paces along that direction of travel looking for the sign. The idea being that he's come across a hard area of ground where the tracks and signs just aren't showing very well, and hopefully he'll pick it up along the direction of travel. And coming out 5 paces, at this point I haven't regained the trail. At this time I'm going to have to employ what we call the round search. I've just conducted a linear search. It didn't work. I did not regain the tracker sign. Having returned back to my last known sign, I'll then employ what we call a round search. The round search starts off by the tracker going back on the trail 5 to 10 paces and then starting a circle in the direction that he feels that the subject may have gone. At that point, the tracker, when he's searching, will face his body outwards away from the last known sign and track in an attempt to regain the trail. I'll demonstrate it for you right now. At this point, I'm going to begin my circle. I've determined that I think the most likely direction my subject may have gone would be to my right. So I'm going to start the circle to the right, and again I'm going to face outward. Okay, right now I've just found my tracking sign. I've actually got some bent vegetation. So at this point, I'm going to proceed on my track. I've regained the trail. Usually speaking, if you employ the search drills properly, 90% of the time, you're going to regain the track and sign. 90% of the time. It just takes patience and techniques. If you have patience and you employ them, they will work. One important point I want to bring out when conducting the round search, and that is to face out and looking away at an angle from your last known sign. You do not look directly at the ground when conducting this search drill. The reason being, if you're looking at the ground and you miss the line of sign and you step over it, it's behind you, it's gone. You've got to do another circle. You've got to come back around out wider because you missed it. On the other hand, if you're searching and you're looking out at an angle, if my line of sign is right there and I'm coming around, I've got several chances to pick it up. I've got several chances. It's the best way to do it.
Sometimes when you're tracking in law enforcement, border patrol, it's important not to follow directly behind the subject that you're trying to track. There's good security reasons for that. After all, they may be setting up alongside the trail waiting for you to come by. That's when we employ another technique for tracking. It's sometimes called the S-trailing or the bump. Let me show you what it means. Right behind me there's a barn, and I'm going to assume that my quarry is headed towards that barn. Now I don't want to walk directly towards it, so what I'll do is I'll make a series of S's over what I presume to be his trail. Each time I cross the trail, I'll mark it. When I don't see the trail any longer, you'll see what happens. At this point, I no longer see the trail following along this way. So he must have turned some direction. I know he didn't turn this direction because I'm here. So he must have gone that way. Now the little S's that I showed you are incredibly small. They're a lot smaller than you'd employ in the field. In the field, you'd make much larger S's that would take you through different kinds of cover and concealment to protect you from whoever might be along that trail. With the S-trailing technique, you're at the X here, and this line describes the track of the person or subject you're trying to follow. The way you trail them is this. You make an S, you cross the trail, you make an S, cross the trail like this. If you come across the trail at this point, you know they've traveled in that direction. At that time, you continue your S's in this way. If you missed them on this portion here and you continued on around and missed the trail entirely, you'd still know, this is you'd still know that they traveled in another direction. And so you pick up your S's once again. So you can go like this, or you can go like this. In any case, you will encounter the trail as you follow it. Bump trailing is very similar. In this case, what happens is you pull in until you encounter the trail, then you bump out until you encounter the trail, and you follow this process. If you find out that you missed the trail, you continue to make a circle until you hit the trail once again, and then you continue to bump it again and again. One of the disadvantages of bump trailing or S-trailing is that you're going to walk many times the distance that your subject is going to walk. It's not good for catching up with your subject. What it's good for is locating a campsite or some other location that they might be using. What's the other one there? Oh, there we go. Got it. Hi, Grogan. How you doing, buddy? Yeah. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to work on something called the tracking pit. We've decided to establish our tracking pit out here in the pasture. Now, what is a tracking pit? A tracking pit is nothing more than an area that you've marked off, an area that you've cleared of track, and one you're going to use to practice reading sign and reading track. The tracking pit can be established in just about any kind of terrain. In fact, you should establish tracking pits in a variety of different terrains. For instance, this one here is on kind of a dirt mixed grass area. You'd also want to put one on gravel, one on sand, and one in a brushy area. This way you get used to reading sign in all the different types of terrain you might encounter when you're doing your tracking. I'm going to use these 4 stakes that I carved earlier to establish the boundaries of our tracking pit. How far are these things going to be apart? Oh, 5 or 6 steps. That's about it. And there you have it, a tracking pit. The next step, clean it up. I'm going to use a broom to sweep the area clear of previous track. Of course, you can use anything you find in nature, like a willow switch or brush or anything else. You may have noticed when I was sweeping that there's a variety of different types of terrain on this piece of land I've chosen. By terrain, what I mean is there's some areas that are very, very soft that are going to take good impressions, some areas that are slightly grassy, and some areas that are hard. These are all important when you're practicing tracking. Now that the tracking pit is prepared, I'm going to lay some track. But before I do that, I'm going to step away from the track a couple of steps so that when I actually enter the track area, I'm going to be up to speed and my track is going to be consistent. In other words, the space between my footfalls is going to be the same clear across it, we hope. There we are. Every skill has a tool, and tracking is no different. In the case of tracking, the tool you use is a thing called a tracking stick. Now, not everybody uses them, but we find they're pretty handy when you're learning how to track. Let me show you what it is. It's my walking stick. But partway up the walking stick, I have this little rubber band attached here. Now, you can use an O-ring or a rubber band as I've done. But this thing is movable. You see, it'll slide up and down. And the intention of this is to identify the length of the track, and this will make it easier for you to locate the next track. Let me show you how it works. Here's how you use this tracking stick. You see the heel of the print that I just made? Right there. I lay the tip of the walking stick alongside the heel of that print. And then down on this end, I match the heel of the other print with a little rubber band. That is the stride. Now, if I want to find another print, what I need to do is to go to my last known print with this stick. Let me show you what I do. I'll move to the next print. Let's say this is the last known print. I lay the rubber band down on the heel, and then look out here. And looky there. Right at the tip is the print. Now let's say, for the sake of argument, that I didn't see a print right there. This allows you to do this. You can create sort of a circle of this kind here, and your next print should occur along that line. Of course, when you do this, you're not actually making a mark in the soil. What you're looking for is another mark that might indicate a print. You never want to destroy your last known print. Now, this can be done with either a stick, as I just showed you. It could be done with a string. Or if you want to, you can use something that I call a sighting stick, which is even easier than this. The sighting stick can be any tall stick or even your walking stick. What I have here is my walking stick has a little notch on it. And I know that if I grab the stick like so and hold it close to my chest and look straight down, I can sight onto the heel of a print. Now you might need to move this thing out or in a little bit until you get a consistent position, but you need to be able to sight across the top of the stick or down the side of this stick to one known print. Once you've got that distance, you could continue on down the trail, and when you lose a track, you place the tip of the stick on the heel of a track that you know, and then sight along the top of the stick. And that gives you a location to search for when you're searching for your next print. I'll show you what I mean. Place it at the heel of the last identified mark, and then you sight down the top of this stick, and you'll see the heel of the next one. After you've set up your tracking pit and begun to work with it, it's a good idea to have people walk through that pit with a variety of different kinds of shoes. Have them walk through in tennis shoes, street shoes, boots, climbing shoes, barefoot, whatever you want. But get as many different kinds of tracks into that pit as you possibly can. And that'll help you to learn a little bit about something called the action indicator. Let's talk about that topic now. Let me show you what I mean by action indicators. We have these bare footprints right in here. You can see someone took a step in here, and then it looks like they hesitated because this foot is angled out in that direction. They were looking that way. And then they took a larger step and put this foot over here, followed up with this foot here. They took another step over to here, backed up into this print here because we've got an overlaid print, as well as here, just a slight slide where the toes move back a little bit. You can see they were over in this area here with toes pointed in this direction and toes pointed in that direction. What that means is that while this person was standing here, they were looking over one direction and then they were looking at the other direction as if they couldn't make up their minds which direction they wanted to go. Finally, they placed their foot back on this step here and took off. So what's an action indicator? Well, an action indicator is some kind of a sign that tells you what your subject was doing. How fast they were walking, where they were looking, where they stopped for a rest, so on and so forth. Now the best way to learn about action indicators is to track with a partner and track through your tracking pit. The way to do that is this. You have your partner walk through the tracking pit and lay some sign. Now this sign is going to show things. You want him to stop, look around, do something. After he exits the sign, he'll come over and grab you. Now you shouldn't be watching what it was that they did when they laid the sign. You walk over and take a look at the tracks that were left behind. At this point, you attempt to interpret what they did while they were in that tracking pit. Now, with your partner there, if you make some incorrect assessment of what was going on, they're there to correct you, to tell you what it was exactly that they did, and then you can learn how a certain action indicator is represented by movement. It's a good way to learn about action indicators. There's another thing you can do in the middle of that tracking pit when you're laying down your action indicators. You could practice counter tracking, misdirection, and so forth. It's a good time for you to learn about how a track looks when someone walks backwards upon their old track, or when they do something else that might be intended to conceal their movements. Something else to remember. Animals don't practice deception. If you're tracking an animal through the forest or in some other area, and the animal's track disappears, they're not trying to deceive you. All that's happened is you're unable to locate the next track. So you go through the exercises for regaining the track. But action indicators are something that's very useful with both animals and humans. Now that we've looked at the tracking pit, we want to do something else with it. We want to start working with aging, get some sense for how fast tracks age. And what we're going to do is we're going to leave this pit alone and let it kind of deteriorate overnight. And when we come back in the morning, we're going to take a look at the tracks that we laid down today and see if anything has happened, if any animals walk through, and so on and so forth. Now, animal behavior is one of the important things that the tracker has in his cornucopia of tools. It's another way they have of aging a track. I'll talk to you more about that a little later. Yesterday when we set up the tracking pit, I said we'd come back and visit again 24 hours later. Well, we're here, and now it's a good time to take a look to see what kind of overlay other animals may have put upon the tracks that I placed there yesterday. We can also take a look at some of the aging factors that are involved with tracks. After doing a quick survey of the tracking pit, I determined that we've got some quail on this property. Let me show you what I found. Now I'm going to use the shadow from my walking stick as a way to point out the areas of interest. The first thing that I noticed was that we've got a track of a couple of quail crossing right in this area here. So we had some quail come through early this morning or late last night. Now one of these quail, the one that made this track here, you follow it down in here, you see that there's a lot of track right in this area. Well, what was going on? Well, that's part of track interpretation. What was happening is as he came into this area, it started to search for food, and it was pecking around in here, disturbing the soil in these little holes that you see, and living behind some prints. After not finding anything, it continued on down this path here. Notice how another set of footprints walked around the area while the second bird was pecking. I believe the pecking bird found no food because quail have a habit of dropping a loaf while they eat. Food in, waste out. No sign of scat was noted in the area. Now there were actually quite a few quail that walked through here. So there's an entire covey right here on this land. What this tracking pit has told me is there's food somewhere around here. When we left here yesterday, I set our camera for time-lapse photography of one of the tracks. The total elapsed time you'll see in this track is about 8 hours. The color changes are due to clouds passing by. There were no unusual weather conditions, no rain or high winds. The air temperature was about 90. What I'd like for you to observe is how the track deteriorates. As the soil dries, the track starts to fall apart. The movements of insects, such as ants, flies, and grasshoppers, helps to collapse the walls of the track. The sharp edges of the track are gone in a very short time. Moist earth will hold its shape for a longer time, but the edges will still dry out first. When you are learning to age sign, it is crucial for you to make impressions and watch them deteriorate over a period of time. This is the track we made 2 days ago, and of course this is a new track that I just made. But you can see how 2 days has affected the way this track looks. You notice some little pits located here and there in the track. Those little pits are made by a light rain that ran through. It wasn't enough rain to actually wet the ground and create mud or anything, just big old droplets that pitted the earth. We've also had some wind action, and you can see now that it's flattened out all of the ridges around the sides of the track and rounded them. So as I say, this is the way your track is going to look after a couple of days of pretty normal weather compared to a brand new fresh one. There you got it now. This print you've been watching all along is 3 days old. This print here is 2 days old. And of course we got a brand new print right here. But you can see now how they've aged, how the edges have almost disappeared due to the action of wind and very, very light rain and some misting. This one here, because it's on harder ground, has disappeared, but you can still see the patterning in the middle. There we go, another print. It's now been 5 days since we made the first print. This is the first print we made 5 days ago. Here's the heel, and here's the forward portion of the foot. You can see most of the patterning has now disappeared. You also notice that the print seems to be fairly large. It's actually expanded because of erosion. It's fallen in and the sides have crawled back away from the print itself. The print that was made 4 days ago is right here. You can see a little bit of patterning in where the sole is and a tiny bit in the heel. This is a little harder ground, but you can see that most of the edges have disappeared by now, and this too has enlarged somewhat. The print that was made about 3 days ago, I don't know, 4 days ago, whenever the heck it was made. Here it is. You can see we still got some patterning. The edges have deteriorated, but you can't really tell very much about the pattern. You can see that there is some sort of a tread in here, and you can still see the forward portion of the foot. So here is another print, the one that was done about 3 days ago, and my current print. We've talked a little bit about action indicators. We've also talked about aging, but there's something else we ought to talk about, and that's called an identification indicator. What's an identification indicator? Well, that's any kind of an indication left in the sign that tells you about the individual that you're following. This could be something like a scuff mark, a change in the sole or heel pattern, or almost anything that helps you to believe that the track you're looking at is the one you want to follow. Now, these identification indicators are kind of important to anybody who's doing some following or tracking as well, particularly for people who are in search and rescue. Let me show you what I mean by that. If you're working on a search and rescue team, most of the folks who work on search and rescue teams wear some kind of a lug pattern sole like this one here. In order to keep your tread from being confused with that of your subject, what you want to do is make some sort of a mark to help with that identification. And one way to do that is to remove a portion of one of the lugs, like this little piece right in here. What this does is it gives you an unusual pattern that's easy for your other team members to identify. It's good tough rubber. I guess that's why they use it in soles. There we go. So now we'd be able to tell this boot from the rest of the boots that are out there. In some teams, they actually go so far as to remove a different one of the points in this central lug in order to identify who that person is. But I don't think that's necessary, just so long as you know which members are team members by removing the same lug from each boot. Earlier you saw how Mark showed you how to draw up the tracking pattern of this sort here. But there's something else that's helpful to record, and that's to record the actual pattern found on the sole of the shoes. For instance, you might record if it's a wavy pattern, a herringbone pattern, a diamond, or even a fish scale type pattern. This helps other people who might be trying to track your subject. So what you do is you draw roughly the shape of the shoe, something like this, and then inside of that shape you put down the type of pattern that you saw inside, something like this, and you write wavy. It's a wavy type pattern. And maybe you found an area that's on the inside of the shoe back in this area here that's worn. So identify that. It's worn. And maybe the back of the heel is worn out as well. Worn. So write this material down on here, and it helps you to remember, but it also makes it easier for other trackers to follow the pattern when they come onto the scene. You don't need to confine your tracking practice to the wilds or even to a tracking pit. Even a lawn gives you good opportunity to work with tracking skills. You can see how my passage across the grass has forced some of the grass to lay down flat. Remember aerial flagging. The lighter underside is visible from above, but this isn't going to last long. This grass is going to start to erect very rapidly, and you're going to see these things will stand up. Still, down below these tracks, there are depressions. Depressions where I kicked off with the toe, right in here, and a little bit of a depression where the heel was, just in this area here. So it's worthwhile trying to add all your senses to your tracking skills. Since tracking is a visual art, light plays a really important part in being able to perform your tracking chores. I thought we ought to take a look at how we can utilize light to our benefit when we're doing some tracking. In order to do this, I'm going to establish the direction of the sun with this little stake right here. So you'll be able to watch this shadow and see which direction the sun is coming from. Obviously it's up in that direction over there. And this is the print we're interested in. Let's take a look at how that print shows up when we change the position of the viewer. From this position here, we're looking into the sun. You'll notice how well the patterning and contrast stand out. Now we're looking away from the sun. You'll notice that the track has all but disappeared. So it's really important that you look towards the source of illumination. Let's try another position. Now we've quartered the sun. you can see that the track is starting to stand out again. We've got good definition on all of the patterning, and you can see the full outline of the print itself. Generally speaking, the best time to do your tracking is in the early morning hours and the late afternoon. That's when the track has the most contrast. If you're forced to track during the middle of the afternoon when the sun is straight up, there's a couple of tricks you can utilize to bring those tracks out. And one of them involves a mirror. Now I have a mirror excuse me, on my compass here. And what I'm going to do is throw a little light from the mirror across the track, and you can see how much the light from my compass brings out that track. Of course, you can do the same thing at night with a flashlight. But this is a handy little trick to know. You can also use a flashlight or a compass mirror like this to point at a track to identify it for other trackers so they can see it as well. There's another little trick. It involves your shadow. If you throw your shadow across the track, you'll be able to see it a lot more clearly than if it's in the sun. As important as light is to the tracking process, probably the best time to do your tracking is at night during a full moon. That's when the tracks literally jump out at you, and you can follow them across some very rough ground. Phew! Boy, that was good. You know, it's good for tracking too. Something about the feet you ought to know. Urine is actually pretty sterile, unless your body is ridden with all kinds of infections. It's okay to apply to your body. In fact, some people have been known to drink this stuff. I don't recommend that. But I do recommend you put it on your feet and let it dry, and then scuff your feet a little bit. The reason for that is this: the uric acid in the urine will help to toughen your feet. It has other uses as well. If an animal is trying to track you, for instance a dog, sometimes, and this isn't a given, but sometimes by urinating on your feet you can alter your scent track just enough to throw them off. If you have the other Woodsmaster videos, you've probably seen this headband before, or at least one that looks a lot like it. Quite a few people have asked us about these things. Where do they come from and how do we use them? Now this one here is part of it's actually a military surplus bandana, and it was twice as long as it is now. I just cut the thing in half. It's made out of cotton. It's pretty stretchy cotton, and just about any cotton will work fine. Somebody asked, how do you put them on? Well, easy, like this. Grab two corners like so, flip it over your head, bring it up till it's over your forehead like so, and just take those two corners that are in the back, tie a knot. Just a little overhand knot back up in there does the job. There you go. That keeps me from blinding aircraft with that bald spot on the top. It's kind of like a wilderness toupee. Now why do I wear the thing? Well, a lot of reasons. When I'm sweating, of course moisture will form up here on my brow as it does with most people, and then that sweat will drip down into my eyes and blind me, or it can do that. Anyway, it's uncomfortable, and this keeps that area fairly dry. Another thing it does, it covers the back of the neck. This is useful for a lot of different reasons. If it's a hot sunny day, keeps the sun off the back of your neck and lets you stay, well, it keeps you a little bit cooler. Another thing it does is sweeps insects away from the back of your neck, and if it's cold, it helps to retain heat. Those are a few uses for the thing as a headband. Now I usually carry a couple of these things with me. Reasons for that will be evident in just a moment. You'll notice the color. Well, I don't usually carry toilet paper into the wilderness, so we use these, or at least I use these, as an alternative to toilet paper. After I perform my mystic ablutions, I'll gather some water out of the stream, rinse it off nicely, and dry it. Of course, it's important that you not use that particular one as an exchange for your headband. So what I do to it sometimes is tie a little knot in the one that I don't want on my face. That helps out. Now you can also use these things for filtering water. Now this isn't going to get down to the biological levels, but at least you can get the big sticks and twigs and moss and fur and all the other stuff that might be in the water out of it. And all you do is put a little bit of sand down in the bottom of it, gather the corners up to make a kind of a bag, and then pour the water that you want to filter down into that sand. And the filter will actually be the sand itself, and water will pour down out of the center of that into whatever it is that you're going to kill with the iodine, chlorine, or whatever else you're using to kill your water. That's just a couple of uses for it. There's thousands of uses for a rag. Sometimes when you're tracking, it's good to know the direction the wind is blowing. Now, there's a lot of ways to do that. You've probably seen where people take a handful of grass and drop it, something like this, and try to determine from the fall of the grass which direction the wind is blowing. I don't find that particularly useful because grass has a tendency to act like a wing and fly wherever it wants, particularly in gentle breezes. Another way that people suggest to do that is to wet your finger and hold it up and find out which side is the coolest. That'll work, but if your fingers are gnarled like mine, you may not be able to feel that slight difference in temperature, or you may get confused. What I prefer is dirt. Dirt always tells me which direction the wind is blowing. Even in the gentlest breeze, the light dust will tell you where the wind is blowing. So there you go. We've been talking about some difficult tracks to follow. Now I want to show you one that's a lot easier to follow. I call it the track of the Homo pigus. Let me show you what I mean. This is the track of the Homo pigus. Leaves sign all around, and it's pretty easy to identify this particular species. In fact, these items here are often used to determine what it was that they had at their last meal. I can see here that there was probably a Wendy's burger in there somewhere. Yeah! God, I love these things. Whenever you're taking off for a trip into the mountains, say a hike or an overnight trip, it's a good idea to leave behind some sort of a note or a track for any would-be searchers or rescuers. Let me show you what I mean by that. I always carry a piece of aluminum foil just as far as the road head. Let me show you how we use this. Take a piece of aluminum foil, a little bigger than your foot, like so. And then find a nice soft sandy spot like this one here. Smooth it out a little bit so it'll take an impression. Put your foil right down over that sandy spot and then step in it. Move your foot around a little bit like so, and you'll be left with a perfect print. I don't know if you can see this, but you've got a nice print there. That's the boot that they're going to be looking for if they come searching for me. If you're ever called upon to go search for someone, the best place to start searching for them is at their vehicle, because that's where they're going to have left some prints. So search around the doors, or in this case the side of the vehicle, in any dirt that might be there. So you can see here, these would be the prints that you'd probably follow. Of course, they could be confused by other searchers or law enforcement who came upon the scene first and searched around a little bit. They might overprint, in which case, if you're going to search for someone, you need to take print copies of everybody who walked in that area so you could discard those prints. The ones remaining are most likely belonging to your subject. First thing you got to learn is you don't chop like this. Believe it or not, that's the way a lot of people chop with a big blade. There is a technique, and it's in the wrist. You probably heard that before. Let me show you the technique. First thing you do is you select a small piece of willow like the one I have here, and you lay it against something that you can cut against without damaging the blade. I'm using this old tree here. Now, when you learn how to chop with a big knife, what you want to learn is that your wrist does most of the cutting, like this. So learn how to just hold your arm stable and move the wrist to chop, like this. So practice that motion until the muscles get used to just chopping in that way. As soon as you've accomplished that, you can move the next portion of your arm, which will be your forearm and your wrist. So your muscles have learned this technique. Now you want to add this. Try to keep your upper arm and shoulder still. Do this. You can see how that chops pretty good now. Now if you really want to throw some energy into it, include your shoulder, upper arm, forearm, and wrist. That'll do the job. Once you start cutting like that, you can move on to heavier pieces of wood, something like this here. You can see it cruises right through and makes a nice smooth cut in the end of the wood. Now, where on the blade am I hitting? Well, I like to hit right up in this area here. That gives me the most power. Now, you know, in the Anaconda knife, we have a little bit of a drop to the blade. You can see how it just sort of drops forward. In this style of knife, you get a little bit more power because the blade is actually preceding the full extension of your wrist, and that's why we designed it this way. Like so. While I'm talking about the Anaconda, I ought to mention that this particular knife has a few features that you might find useful. Let me show you those. Another feature of the Anaconda is these three little teeth here. Some people think this is a saw, but that's not the function. These are actually a wire cutter. They're capable of cutting wire like barbed wire, chain link fence, and other kinds of wire. Let me show you how to use these. What you do is you lay the teeth over the top of the barbed wire or wire you're trying to cut. You see that it engages it perfectly there. To cut the wire, you simply bend back and forth. In order to use this big knife as a small knife, I've attached a lanyard. This here is the lanyard. What you do is you put your hand through the lanyard and your forearm about like so. And then you grip the blade by the spine, just as you see here. Now I have good control over the small cutting edge on the front of the knife. And I can work about like this to do my carving. It also allows me to use the tip of the tanto like a little drill. I've got good control because I'm just using my forearm and wrist to control the knife. But you can see this gives you a nice straight little edge. Now there's another thing about this edge that's handy. It's a lot easier to sharpen than a curved edge at the forward portion of your knife. All you have to do is kind of file it. That's a couple of features that I find handy about this design. Another thing about the tanto tip is it tends to be stronger than other designs. You don't have to be shy about prying with the tanto tip. We've talked a lot about knives, but we haven't talked much about sharpening those knives. Remember, the knife is the most important tool that you have. Now, there are a lot of different ways to sharpen a knife. You've probably been taught things by your parents or your great-grandfather or some Indian chief or who knows who. But everybody's got their own way to sharpen a knife. And the funny thing is, a lot of those things are contradictory. So I'm going to show you some tools and some techniques for sharpening a knife. And some of these things you probably cringe at. Others, on the other hand, will probably make a lot of sense to you. So let's take a look at these. I thought I'd start with these two sharpening tools here. These are probably the coarsest but fastest ways to sharpen a blade. These don't do anything for your blade but peel off metal. Both of these rely on little carbide cutting edges set in a V. This means that the cutting angle for your edge is going to remain constant all the time you're sharpening. But it also means that it's going to remove a lot of steel from your blade. Let me show you how these are used. What you do is you hold your blade about like this. Now with a big blade it's easier to do it this way, but you hold it with the blade facing up. You see this little guard here? That's to protect your fingers. These things are kind of scary. You put the blade into the little V made by the cutting edges, and then you draw about like so. And that actually scrapes little bits of steel right off your edge. But it puts an edge on very quickly. About like so. Same idea with this one. Just draw it like that, and you can hear a little squeaking. That's removing steel from my edge. Not a great thing, but it puts a quick serviceable edge on your steel. Another way to put an edge on your knife is something like this device here. This is called an easy lap, and there are several designs like this one. But inside there's a little rod that you can tighten into place with a collar, and this rod has diamond flakes on it. You'll see there's a round side and a flat side like so. This really steals the metal from your knife, so you can bring it to an edge in a hurry. These people Easy Lap also make this device here. It's just a little flat metal plate with the diamonds impregnated in the surface. And these come in fine, medium, and coarse grade as well. I'll show you how to use those things in just a few minutes. There's another device. This one doesn't rely so much on removing metal as putting it back into place, and there's a little bit of a grinding taking place as well. This one here has two little rods set in at an angle to hold the proper edge angle. One side of this thing is a coarse, this one over here is a coarse rod that removes a little bit of metal, and this one over here is fine. These are made out of ceramic, and the main idea of these is to force the edge back into some sort of lineup. Now this one here is useless on a big blade like this job here, because this has a 1/4 inch metal and it won't fit down in there, so you can't sharpen with it. But ideally you just drop your blade down inside there and draw it back and forth, and that'll put the edge back on it. Another idea in the ceramic field is this one here. This little device is called a Lansky sharpener, and it's made in a triangle. You see a little groove down the center here. You can use that groove for sharpening fish hooks. The edges can be used to sharpen things like serrated knives, and the flat portions will sharpen conventional knives and axes. There's another level that you can go to, and that's this. This is just a piece of steel. This one's actually a Gerber steel. But this is what I use a lot to dress my edges. And it doesn't really take any metal off of your edge. It doesn't remove any metal. All it does is line the edges back up again. What happens a lot of time when you're cutting with a knife is the edge does not wear off. It just folds over. It kind of bends over a little bit. And these types of tools here push that edge back into line where they can do the cutting for you. The last and most unconventional way, or perhaps it's even the most conventional way to sharpen an edge, is just a piece of leather called a strop. And I'm going to show you how to use that as well. With most of these rod type sharpeners, the directions call for you to move the blade in this manner here, like you're cutting off a piece of cheese. So you're actually cutting into the edge of the steel, like so. The trick is to keep the same angle while you're doing it. What is that angle? Well, different manufacturers manufacture their blades with different cutting angles at the very edge here. What I generally do is I lay my thumb on the top of the rod, like so, and use that to keep the edge at a consistent angle. So while I'm drawing it, I just lay the blade down on top of my thumb, and you can see it's hitting on the rod right here, and then draw it like so, with a little bit of a forward motion. There's not too much change in edge angle if I do it that way. And of course, after you do one side, you flip it over and do the other side. So that's the same with that tool or with this little piece here. Same idea. Just cut a piece of cheese. Now, that's what they tell you. There's another way to work these things, and that's to hold the blade still like you see here. In this case, you work these tools like a file, like this. See, this is the way they used to sharpen axes. They file the edge. And it's real easy to hold the same angle with your tool if you're using the tool as the part that moves. You can see here, I can just stay at it like so. How hard do you press? Not very hard. If you press hard, you're going to roll that edge over. You don't want to do that. So just a light pressure on here is usually enough to get the edge back on your blade. And as you do it, go lighter and lighter and lighter, like that. And then turn it over, and you can go the other direction. Like so. And then to finish it off, you can hold the bar at an exact angle and move it back and forth in this way a few times. If you do this, that kind of finishes the edge and brings everything back into line. There we go there. Now, with these little Easy Lap pieces of this type, these are also used in that manner. Just use them like a real fine file. Just gently Press on the edge, and that'll buff this baby up to a razor sharpness. If you're using a sharpening steel, same idea. Just go like that, like so. Remember, any of these tools can be used both ways. Like this, and like that. Of course, you always want to be careful that you're not going to put your hands in the way of that moving blade. The sharper it gets, the safer it gets, unless it touches your skin. So there you go. That's some of the basics of sharpening with these types of tools. Now, another thing that people use is a sharpening stone. That's just a piece of flat grinding stone, and they either move it in a circle or they move it in this manner here against the stationary stone. Most people don't carry those nowadays. Most people work with these little tools. Let me show you the strop. Stropping's kind of a funny word. I never could figure out if it means strapping or if it's just a word that's taken from the sound that you make when you use it. Strop, strop, strop. Whatever it is, it's a way of sharpening your knife with a piece of leather. Now, usually what I use is my belt. That's this thing here. You may have noticed that it's a little bit large. What this actually is a cinch strap. I went down to a tack shop and I picked up a big long piece of cinch strap here. It's about 2 inches wide. Bought a little buckle, or a big buckle, and some other little bangles and dangles and things like that, and put it together. And this is my equipment belt as well as my sharpening tool. Now, you don't have to have a belt like this to do stropping. I also have my utility bag here, and this is also made out of leather. This can be used as easily as the belt. I even have the sheath that I put my knife in, and I can use this. You can use the side of your boot or anything else that's made of leather, or even a very, very abrasive cloth like Cordura. But let me show you how these things are used. What you do when you're stropping is you're taking the metal that's on the edge of your blade and you're laying it down flat. Typically when you're sharpening an edge, the corners or the edges of the blade like to fold over a little bit. And stropping just brings that back up into line where it gives you a great cutting edge. Another thing it does is it breaks off little burrs that you might have gotten on there when you were doing your initial sharpening. So how do you do it? Well, you can see I backed this piece of leather up with a tree stump. And the way you do it is different from the way you're sharpening. You see, you draw away from your edge, like so. Turn it over and pull across. This may not seem like it does much, but once you've done it to a blade, you realize it really does a lot. Now, what angle am I laying it at? It's actually just about flat. It's about flat with the flattened edge of the blade here, this ground out portion. So it's about at that angle. You don't want to go in too steep because that'll actually fold the edge over. You want to come in sort of shallow, like this. So you go like this, maybe 6 or 8 strokes on one side, turn it over, and do 6 or 8 strokes on the other side. Don't press too hard. The idea isn't to press, but to kind of wear that edge back into place. Once you've done this a few times, like so, it'll be ready to go. That edge will be polished and nice and sharp. I took my belt down to the stream and wet it, so it's just moist, that's all. Let me show you what you do next. You lay it in the dirt, like this. You put some dirt in it. And you do it to both sides. Now that it's good and dirty, let's go find a tree. Once you've got your belt dirty, you take it over to a tree, and you can either wrap it around the base of the tree, or if you've got a little piece of ladder wood like this one here, you can kind of hang it over the ladder wood like that. And you can see that's good and solid in this way. If you back it up with your knee like so, you can strop right on your knee. You got to be careful if you do this. You don't want to slice your pants up, and worse yet, you don't want to slice your leg up. So be kind of careful. Give it a few strops on each side and go easy. Now, in the olden days, you might remember that barbers would just hold the piece of leather like so and strop like this. It was kind of awkward, but you get the idea. They would do that. Well, on a hollow ground blade, that works pretty good. But in these big field knives, it doesn't work so well. In fact, you may lose more edge than you put onto it. So, whoop, there we go. So I recommend that you back it up and do it like this. There you go. You can also use dirt on your stationary stropping posts like this one. What you do is you take a little dirt from the ground and rub it into the stropping leather like so, and then do it just the way you would do it if you didn't have any dirt on there. Just rub it like so. Now, of course, this is a field expedient. If you were back at your hacienda, why, you might use something like jeweler's rouge. That gives it a really high polish and really brings the edge out on these things. Brings it out to shaving sharpness. Now, something about shaving sharpness, that's not necessary on a field knife like this. In fact, I don't think that's a real good idea. It's nice to have it good and sharp so that you can chop things easily, but if you put a shaving edge on it, it's also going to be a fairly fragile edge. So if you're chopping heavy or hard woods, you're going to lose the edge in a hurry. So I like a field edge, sharp enough to say, yeah, that'll cut, but dull enough that I don't lose any hair. Now that we've ground and stropped our blade, we have some exposed steel. You see, this area up in here is just coated a little bit, but down in here on any knife you're likely to expose a real fine edge. Of course, that's the idea, that will rust more easily than other portions of the blade. So what you do then is use something like this. We use this tough cloth here, the marine tough cloth, and we just rub this material right into it. And this will help to retard any chance that it's going to discolor any more than it has, and it'll also retard the rusting process, like so. Just rub a little bit on. Most of the stuff is safe. You can also use, if you'd like to, olive oil or butter or any other kind of wax or oil. There you go. So there she is, nice and sharp, buffed up, and ready to cut. There we go. Well, something new. We talked a little bit about the anaconda, and now I got something else to talk about. I mentioned in a previous volume a fellow named Rob Simonich out of Clancy, Montana. Now, Rob's a custom knife maker, and I think I mentioned that he's an artist with steel. Well, he's created a new knife, and it's called the Kanji, and that's it right here. Except for one little thing, this isn't steel. This is a new metal called talonite. It's actually a cobalt alloy, so there's no steel in this. See, this knife is not magnetic. It can withstand temperatures up to 2,000 degrees. It's not tempered, it's actually aged. In addition to those unusual properties, this metal will not rust. In fact, it doesn't even stain. This particular knife is the exact knife we used in the jungle survival video, the one that you saw cleaning monkeys and so forth. But there are no stains and no marks on it. How well does talonite hold an edge? Incredibly well. Because of the way this stuff is made, it actually cuts better than any steel that I've ever seen before. But you're going to be seeing a lot more of talonite in the near future, and quite a bit more of this knife. You'll notice on the design of this knife we've included the tanto tip. So we've got that little forward section right up in here that we can use for carving little fine things. And the blade is designed as a general purpose camp knife. But I really like this thing, and this has become my favorite carry-around blade. Well, that's about it for the fundamentals of tracking. You've seen a lot of little tips and techniques and all the basic stuff that's related to tracking. You need to know these things in order to do what's most important of all. You need to practice. This isn't some kind of a skill that you can watch on the TV set and sit back and say, yeah, I got that, and then go out and do it in an emergency. Tracking has to be practiced. You have to go out and make that tracking pitch. You have to go out and follow a friend. You have to go out and do all of these things again and again and again. And eventually, some little thing will click over in your mind and you'll be a tracker. But it takes time, and it's not easy. We hope you enjoyed this volume of the Woodsmaster, and we hope to see you in the next one. Meanwhile, I hope to see you on the trail.